years?
Well, so we could put the same question to those who would regulate and try to establish some way of reining in the damaging effects of nuclear proliferation. Well, it's going to happen anyhow. Isn't it naive to think that we can scale it back? Well, but that's not a reason not to try in the case of nuclear weapons or in the case of using biotechnology to transform the nature of childhood. There's another part of the question you asked earlier, Elliot, about the inevitable flow of this. The analogy to low-tech means of hyperparenting. Mm-hmm. You said earlier, and rightly, look, we hyperparent, we micromanage and hover and mold and shape our children in all manner of ways.
The 1,400 SAT gene,
right.
But we're going to pay thousands of dollars for SAT coaches
right.
and educational consultants
right.
and all the rest of it. Isn't that
right.
the same?
Well, there are some who would try to draw a sharp line between the two and say, no, the bioengineering is fundamentally different. And in some ways it's different. But what I would say is, I agree there is something similar in spirit to the use of biotechnology to try to pick and choose the genetic traits of our children and the low-tech forms of hyperparenting that you've just described.
And even higher tech, because as you know from recent research, the brain is not fixed genetically at birth, but adapts and evolves in response to stimulus.
Okay.
And it is very likely you can improve intelligence by those hyper methods.
All right, but
it's very likely that many of us in the room were improved by those hyper efforts of our parents. If you think back.
But here's my answer to that. I haven't answered.
And our brain is actually structurally different as a result of those efforts.
Fair enough. So I'm not quarreling with the idea that there is a certain continuity among these practices.
Right.
But what I would say is that we shouldn't conclude from the similarity between genetic enhancement of children and low-tech forms of hyperparenting, pressuring, high-pressurized techniques of child raising. We shouldn't conclude from that therefore genetic engineering is just fine. I would conclude to the contrary. Maybe that should give us reason to question some of the low-tech, high-pressured, micromanaging, hyperparenting that has become rife in this generation, because that too is, I think, gradually transforming children into instruments of our ambition, products of our will as parents, products of our manufacture, rather than independent, unpredictable beings who remind us, and here I'm less worried about the effect on the child, I think, than the effect on us as parents, who remind us by their very unpredictability of the limits on our control. They teach us, and we have very few places to learn this in a society given over to mastery and control over everything. They remind us of a certain kind of humility and limit to our kind of power to exercise dominion over the world that I think we need. And so I think as parents we lose something if we succeed in molding the children, never mind the effect on the child.
You're beginning to sound, especially with your choice of dominion, as if underlying much of your position is actually a religious sensibility, and that somehow you're talking about the hubris or the pride or the arrogance of taking God's place.
Elliot, I had a different take on that. And my take is that it was very culturally specific, that his remarks were framed in a contemporary cultural norm in which children are given a great deal of individuality and freedom, which is certainly not the case in many other cultures, and isn't the case historically. It has been the case, as you well know, historically, that children are purposely bred or raised
let me
for continuation of a family. That is not how we see it, but are we to tell another culture.
Well, let me
what
just
they
reverse
should
that
do.
question, Bill. And then after that, I want to do two things. I want to prove that you are whistling Dixie, because just like Jay Leno, I happen to have a film clip of 25 years from now, which I'm going to show you what society is going to be like. But before that, I'm going to take Bill's question. And you talk about other cultures or other societies. Let's just imagine, let's take Singapore, for example, or a culture that might be more tolerant of control. And let's say it was government policy there to use genetic screening and other hyper-science capabilities to actually increase the intelligence of the population by screening for and against certain things, increase the height, increase the strength, and this goes on for a while. And meanwhile, because of your moral philosophy, we don't do that here, and instead, as the old eugenicists would have said, our least intelligent people, arguably, reproduce at a higher level than our more intelligent, and so forth and so on. So isn't there then, that by that very cultural difference Bill presents, yet another challenge to your ability to keep the genie in the bottle?
Well, I'm against eugenics in any culture, whether it's in Singapore or in the United States. And I do think that there are certain universal moral ideals, though not lived up to in any particular historical period or any particular society, but that doesn't mean that we can't try to argue our way through and reason our way through to the ideals that we want to affirm and defend. In Singapore, it's true, it's not even merely hypothetical. In Singapore, there is now, Lee Kuan Yew brought in a decade or two ago a voluntary, non-coercive eugenic policy to try to get the well-educated to have more children and the less well-educated to have fewer. And so he designed, now this was not forced sterilization as in the old-fashioned eugenics, but he had a very elaborate, clever, voluntary eugenic program which consisted for college graduates, there were special he had a computer dating service. This is like the one that Bill was describing. He had free love boat cruises for college graduates, so they would meet and mix and he hoped to procreate.
Has been one of the lowest birth rates.
In the world. Well, this is what he's trying to
and they're still
change.
trying it because they.
And on the other hand, for those at the bottom, he would offer free apartments, government-subsidized or free apartments for those who had no more than a grade school education, provided that in exchange they were willing to undergo sterilization. So now we can talk about different cultural practices, but I think that that's morally troubling eugenics, whether it takes place in Singapore or whether it takes place in 29 American states had forced sterilization laws in the 1920s and 30s. And as for dominion, bringing in, there is a certain kind. I will plead half guilty, Elliot, to the question about whether there aren't certain religious ideals rattling around in our moral intuitions on this. I don't think any of the argument I've made or any of the worries I've voiced about overreaching necessarily depend on a particular religious view. But it is true that, and in the book I talk about an ethic of giftedness, appreciating children as gifts that are not fully our doing or fully within our control. And we need to remind ourselves, because we are prone, especially in our society now, we are prone to aspire to a kind of Promethean mastery over everything. And that's why I think it's so important to preserve certain parts of life, certain spheres of moral life, and family life and the parent-child relation is one of them, that preserve norms of unconditional love that aren't given over to the consumer ethics, and that remind us, whether we like it or not, that we have to rein in our impulse to control. Now, talking about an ethic of giftedness, an appreciation life or children as gifts, unpredictable gifts, worrying about the hubris of overreaching. There is a religious resonance to that, and some will come to these ideas from certain religious traditions. And I welcome that. But I'm trying, part of the project of the book is to make available a language of moral reflection about these practices that are welcoming to those who come from a secular point of view, but who worry about overreaching in a kind of consumer-driven eugenics, and those who may come to worry about dominion from faith traditions.
Well, I must